So what I'd like to reiterate is that just keep your comments brief if you can, or your question brief. And so, and if you want a particular speaker to answer that question, you can point that out as well. Why don't we start from the right and then move this way and back and forth? Please.
Is this, yes, I guess it is working. My name is Ed Ahern. I retired from Brown a year ago after teaching here for 49 years. So I'm the Emeritus University Professor and Professor of Comparative Literature and French Studies. I say that because it's related to my sense of historical patterns at Brown in relation to the program today. First of all, I want to say congratulations to the people in Middle Eastern Studies for being so powerfully effective. When Vartan Gregorian became president of Brown, I was chairman of comparative literature, and I went to him and I said, you of all people must be incensed by the fact that Brown does not teach the Arabic language, and that we have no courses in Middle Eastern studies. In his energetic way, he said, I will give Arabic to comparative literature. And that amounted to one position. So that at the outset, there was one person struggling to teach all of the levels of language and also tried at the same time to teach a course or two in Middle Eastern literature or culture. That's a couple of decades' time, and look how that has evolved. So I congratulate you on all that's represented by this presentation today. Personally, I am opposed to any action, military action by the United States in Syria for the very reasons that you all gave today. But it might be worth, in terms of the concept of the military-industrial university complex, of mentioning another feature of history at Brown, that is to say, at least faculty attitudes towards certain wars. Students may not be aware that during the Vietnamese War, the Brown faculty went on strike to oppose the war in Vietnam. However, and thinking back in terms of the comments that have been made about the history of colonialism in the Middle East, the Vietnamese War, which was horrendous in so many ways, that was Cold War against Russia, right? The domino theory, if they win there, they're going to spread all over the world. But if you take a step back historically, you see that in effect, the United States was stepping into a failed French region, of colonial region. In contrast,
can you get to your question, please?
No, may I add one brief comment? In the spring of 2003, the faculty was presented a motion to oppose the invasion of Iraq before the invasion took place, and the faculty knuckled on it. Not that a motion passed by the Brown faculty would have prevented that invasion, but when I think back about what that war has done, and the attitude of the faculty in general, no, we should not be involved in opposing it. So I'm simply raising the question, how in the university community we respond to the horrors of war, and what you've all done today is a wonderful example of what can be done.
Thank you so much for that comment. It's really important to know your own history, speaking as a historian. Can we get to this?
Is it working? Yes. Mine is a question. So,
your name?
I'm David Katzovich. I'm a sophomore at Brown. And I had Professor Shibusawa last semester. I recommended everyone. So Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Gulf states have invested billions upon billions of dollars into the rebels, primarily into al-Nusra and the Free Syrian Army, etc. I guess my question is, why have they done this ideological and religious reasons aside, purely geopolitically, economically, etc.? Why have they done this, and what is their ultimate goal in the Middle East, especially vis-a-vis Iran and oil interests, etc.? So what is the plan of the Saudis and the Qatar and the Gulf states for the future of the Middle East if their plans in Syria succeed?
I think we're going to sick Elias on that one.
Saudi Arabia is motivated primarily by the Iranian threat, the strategic threat. That has shaped its foreign policy decisions not only in 2011 until today, but going back much farther. And so if you go back, as far as 2005, you see basically a proxy war taking place between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Originally, the arena of that proxy war was Lebanon, and that has shifted now to Syria. As for Qatar, I am not ashamed to admit that I don't understand Qatari foreign policy. As far as I can tell, Qatari foreign policy is about doing the opposite of what Saudi Arabia does, except in the case of Syria, where it's working to destabilize Assad, but probably not necessarily in the same way that the Saudi intelligence is working. They're supporting different groups. But I'm not an expert on Qatari foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. So is the general plan of Saudi Arabia to weaken Iran and establish more or less hegemony over the Middle East?
Do they have a plan?
I hope.
No, that's an important thing to consider. We assume that there are rational actors who understand all the stakes involved and are operating in a completely in a wise and balanced way that takes into account all of the things that we're concerned about here. In many cases, that's just not true. We have to admit a certain amount of stupidity and ignorance into the equation to fully understand what's happening. There are destructive elements at play here. There are also irrational elements at play. And there are egotistical, conceited, self-centered elements at play, alongside some very far-reaching visions. So I think that's important to point that out.
I would just add very quickly that Saudi Arabia has been in a struggle through the 50s and the 60s with Egypt for leadership of the Arab world. Egypt at that time represented a socialist, top-down, authoritarian, Republican regime that called for modernization a la that style, while Saudi Arabia represented a coalition of monarchies that were pretty much tied to the United States and the old colonial regime. The 1973 war, 67 really, but also capped by 1973, finished Egypt off. And Saudi Arabia at that time also benefited from an enormous spike in the price of the oil. And it raised its budget by hundreds and hundreds of percents. So they came to have soft but potent money power. And they have worked tirelessly throughout that time to take leadership. And 1979 came as a rude awakening. So what I would say is they're in a mode of regime survival, maintaining Saudi power and family in the face of the fact that the region all around them is suffering some cataclysmic and transformations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Hassan Al-Sawab, we spoke about different things. What about humanitarian issue? We have kids getting knifed, killed and burned and gassed. And we're talking about quality of life here. If the United States does not intervene, who's else going to intervene in the world? The Syrian people have no one. I'm Syrian, and I can tell you no one. And they're scared for their life. And we're talking about economic here. Really, humanity should take more precedent over everything. We're 21st century. This is a Holocaust of 21st century. If we don't do anything to stop it, then shame on us. That's what I say. Thank you.
To say that we're against military action doesn't mean we mean nothing should happen and that it should continue to be the sort of mass murder that's happening. It's just a question of whether or not, I can't really get into a huge debate with you on this, but it's a question of whether or not this is the most effective means of bringing more peace into the area.
Well, we gotta stop the killing first. These kids, their children, there should be a method that we propose an academic how we're gonna stop the killing.
I think this, I can completely understand this question because it is a very serious crisis there. I'm not sure we here in this room can do that much individually or personally other than what we try to do, but there's no doubt that only a political solution can gain traction in stopping the killing, because if you just get one side to win over the other right now, that doesn't mean the killing stops. It may very well, in fact, continue into ethnic cleansing and mass murder of minorities. So there has to be a plan that if you do get one side to win, what then do you do in terms of finding a political solution? And the question then becomes, does a military strike by the United States push forward the military solution, or does it delay or foreclose a diplomatic solution, or does it delay or foreclose a diplomatic solution? And judging from what we have seen over the last 20 years, the latter is the more likely option.
Can I just add one thing? I think the U.S. has been involved since the beginning of the struggle in Syria, so I kind of understand your question now after all the killing, but we have to remember that they have been involved in the conflict in Syria for so long. They have been involved to prolong it, and backing sometimes the regime and the opposition in order to drain the state and the people, and then and then maybe they will intervene at the end. I don't know, but the question of do we want them to intervene? They are there. They have been there. So.
Well, they intervene financially, and this is great. But to equate the war in Syria to Iraq is a huge misunderstanding. The weapon of Iraq were hidden. The chemical weapon in Syria has been used. There's thousands of evidence, not only once, over tens of times. So even to say that when America used a weapon of mass destruction and equate that with Assad is doing, it's a huge difference. What we're witnessing right now is a killer, madman, a regime who's been a terrorist list since 1979 against innocent civilians, killing innocent civilians. And we have, as a humanity, to do something to stop their killing actions. And I think military actions, it will, today, the news that Assad willing to give up his chemical weapon. If President Obama did not really brave the military option, he will never do that. So that's an advantage of waiting the military option.
Well, thank you. Can we...
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's a really related question. I guess I'm wondering if the U.S. military did not take action, what kind of international political response options are there? And especially, I guess, in light of, I think, hearing about Kerry trying to have negotiations happen and people failing to come to the table. And so what kind of international negotiations are possible, and would the U.S. need to be involved in those, or other former colonial, or would the former colonial powers need to be involved in those?
So I'll just very quickly... Hello? Sorry. I think what Elias said in the beginning is very important. This is not something you can paper over. You need a very serious diplomatic realignment of the region based on an agreement by many parties that are not now talking to each other. You cannot have a solution for Syria without Iran becoming involved in the negotiations, and the United States has already said, when there were many calls for an international meeting in which you bring together China, Iran, the United States, Russia, etc., the United States said, we will not attend because Iran might participate. And therefore, all these efforts have failed so far because of that reason. So I think this is one major problem. Without Iran participating in these negotiations, I don't see any kind of a serious lasting solution. And the United States must think, what is the price of not talking to Iran on this issue? There are many other things that can be done meanwhile. If the Russian proposal that Syria should give up its chemical weapons under international supervision is accepted by the Syrian regime, what then? Will the United States again say, but we will not go forward for a political solution because Iran might participate in the talks? I think we have to be very open about the fact, as Mayssun said, that the United States has been extremely involved in this conflict from the very beginning. They have forces in Jordan and elsewhere. They're training troops in Jordan, and they're positioning weapons. They've done the same thing on the Turkish side. And it seems, judging from what happened over the past 2 years, that if there's one logic governing that intervention, it is to keep both sides bleeding. And to think that this military strike is sudden turn of mind, a sudden change in policy, a sudden humanitarian fever that has captured the imagination, I think would be a mistake.
Hi. I guess thank you also for holding this meeting. I think it's been very informative. I want to ask actually in regards to the Russian proposal. One, and I guess anyone should answer, how realistic do you think the proposal is? How realistic do you think the proposal is logistically? How realistic do you think the proposal is given the political landscape and the opinions of the different actors at this time? And are there any historical examples or analogies that we can use to inform our thinking on this proposal?
None of us are military experts, so I think it's difficult to answer most of the details in the question. As for precedents, I don't know enough about what has happened in the past to judge the feasibility of the proposal, but it seems like it's a positive step in that the pressure, the threat for a military strike has created an opening to kind of put the brakes on and to give everybody a chance to save face. And that's really what it looks like has been in the works now. It gives President Obama's administration a win by saying, look, we actually got what we wanted. It gives the Russians a kind of opening, a chance for them to show that they can hold sway in Syria. And it also it allows Assad to kind of demonstrate, to not absorb this military hit, and it basically allows everybody to not do anything, which is kind of what the U.S. has been wanting to do from the beginning. They don't want. They had been very open about this, about not wanting to destabilize this or destabilize that or hurt this or hurt that. So it's kind of a perfect solution. Let's just hope it works out.
Thank you.
I'm Alan Gorchin-Negron. I'm a freshman at Brown. And touching off to the last question, could I ask 2 questions? Okay.
Quickly.
All right, so first question. Considering how this military strike will occur, and it's limited to an extent, and projecting into the future, if it would give the rebels a moderate gain of some sort, would it successfully prevent Assad from using further chemical weapons, or backfire and cause him to use them all at one time?
Did you want to ask your second question?
Okay, and also for the second question, does Obama have enough bargaining power with Russia to prompt them to perhaps change their stance and push Assad with further strength to the bargaining table? And if so, does Russia have enough influence over Assad to do so?
Well, on the chemical weapons front, the United States had made it very clear that they will not be attacking any chemical weapon depots, because then it could be catastrophic. And they've also made it clear that it could be anywhere in severity from a shot across the bow, which is how it was first represented by President Obama, to a possible degrading of some abilities. But nobody's talking about changing the balance of power. So the United States is not saying we're interfering militarily in order to actually stop the war. I think that has to be clear. But I think there is a real fear that if some of the rebel groups do get an edge and do win the war as a result of this strike, that they might get to these chemical weapons before the United States does, and they hate the United States a lot more than Assad does. So there's a real concern. In whose hands will these chemical stockpiles end up in Syria? Second question.
On the second issue about Russia, about whether or not, how much bargaining power, how much leverage Obama has over the Russians, I think it's a bit of a moot point, because I agree with Professor Doumani that the real stakeholder in Syria is Iran and not Russia. Russia has actually very little to lose or gain in Syria. They have a long-term ally in Assad, but they will find ways of cultivating a new ally in Syria. They're not as invested in Syria financially, historically, strategically as Iran is, and that is why Iran has to be the primary interlocutor there. If anything happens in Syria that is geared towards a political solution, it has to involve the United States speaking with Iran. And I think that process has already happened. It's very quiet, it's below the radar, but we know that Assistant Secretary of State Jeffrey Feltman had been holding meetings with the Iranians, or had been reaching out to the Iranians for the past couple of weeks. There have been some conciliatory tweets from the Iranian regime the past week, wishing happy Rosh Hashanah, and also a tweet from the former president saying that he believed that Assad actually had deployed chemical weapons. So in the cloak and dagger kind of game of these diplomatic messages in the 21st century, we shouldn't be surprised that if the next kind of big development within the next few weeks, who knows, is that there is some kind of Iranian U.S. dialogue taking place. That's my guess.
Thank you.
Hi, you were talking about Iran.
Your name, please?
My name's Lily. I read, and I can't remember now where I read it, an article about the United States intercepting a message from Iran to Iraqi jihadist groups telling them that if the United States were to attack Syria, they should attack United States interests in Iraq. Did you hear about that? And if so, do you have any predictions for what an attack on Syria might set off in the sort of geopolitical region, whether that might incite an even greater war?
I don't have an answer to that, obviously. I'm an Americanist, but I also want you to sort of think about where you got your information, right? To think about where that came from, and to sort of you can read it, but also try to trace where that's coming from, and who can gain from that sort of position, that sort of supposition out there.
Well, it's also, we go back to the same question, that the same dilemma that anyway, the U.S. is not going to bomb Syria in order to change the balance of power, so this is not going to affect so much the Iranian position in there. Can we ask really what is going on in Syria? It's all geopolitics going on. There are people in there, and there are so many. It's not only the geopolitical factors that will affect where Syria is going. There are also the people on the ground and
I don't
so
mean to imply that.
No. I just it has been the case. So. We always think of struggles as geopolitics, and we really forget the internal social analysis.
Let me put Mayssun at ease here and tell her that on November 8th, the title of our conference on Syria is Beyond Geopolitics.
Yeah.
So it's already on the website, and we will bring in people who are watching very closely the health situation and preparing a major report for the Lancet, and people who work on political economy, and in addition to public health, and people who work on development. And so we will get a chance to delve more into these issues. But I do agree with you that there are so many unknowns about what might happen, what this might spark. And it's such a tinderbox that those who watch the region closely know that there could be many, many things that happen that could make us regret striking, not to change the war, but just striking to do something else, credibility or whatever it may be. I know that I'm being told over and over again through secret hand signs that we're very late. But I would like to test your patience and maybe take a couple more questions. I know there's people in the back that haven't had a chance, but I can assure you that my office and those of my colleagues have always been open for anyone to come and talk with us. So we'll take just quickly a couple more questions, one and then two. Yes.
Hi, my name is Josette. I'm a senior here at Brown. My question is for Dr. Muhanna. I hope I said that right. You mentioned towards the end that you called for a comprehensive international framework, and you mentioned something about U.S., Lebanon, and a couple other nations cooperating. And I'm wondering if what you mean by that is by a global international framework of decolonization, because of how we've seen that is one of the giant roots of this issue, or are you referring to more the kind of diplomatic ties between U.S. and Britain? And I find that what is going on in the Middle East does have an international framework, but one that involves child killers trying to quote unquote end child killing, and one that involves Great Britain selling chemical weapons to places and not having any sort of repercussions for that. And so does that fit into the international framework? And I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, the international framework that I'm envisioning, or not me, I'm just kind of parroting, is the broad terms of that involve some kind of an international conference that brings together the Arab League, the United Nations, the EU, the United States, Russia, China, Iran, the major stakeholders in Syria, to sponsor basically an agreement between the regime, with or without Bashar al-Assad, and the opposition, the political opposition, and whatever unification it can muster among the military opposition. That involves political changes on the ground. It involves basically a new social contract for Syria. It involves some kind of political architecture that enables freedoms, freedom of speech, political freedoms and rights, amnesty for political prisoners. But ultimately, what it really involves is somebody to guarantee that agreement can happen, and they have to guarantee it on a military level. And what I suggested in my talk was that the sad reality is that no one's going to do that job in Syria. No one will do the job that Syria did in Lebanon, to quote somebody who I read recently. Syria was the enforcer of that agreement after the end of the Lebanese civil war in Lebanon, and it did that with its own army. I don't see anybody ready to commit hundreds of thousands of troops to enforce a Syrian end of war agreement at this stage. So to me, that's the heartbreaking reality, and we just have to see how things develop.
Can I just ask a clarification question?
Quickly.
Okay. Are you saying then that the United States, given its proven track record for not really standing up to what it believes in terms of human rights and chemical weapons, is capable of actually enforcing this?
No.
Thank you.
Can we, yes please, last question.
I'll try to be brief. My name is Justice Gaines. I'm a sophomore here at Brown. I kind of have a problem with the way that this situation is being only compared to Bush in Iraq, when I think it's purposely ignorant not to realize the differences in these situations, and the fact that Syria is a very, very different situation than Iraq. And there's the history behind it is a totally, completely different thing as far as Obama and Bush. And so my thing is, this statement of making a bombing for chemical weapons is a humanitarian statement, more so than actually doing the bombings themselves. And I'm wondering if those who do not support the bombing or support this statement of bombing can live with the humanitarian causes, when the one fact that we do know about Syria is that chemical weapons were used to kill over 1,000 people. And that's genocide. And in Darfur, when there was genocide happening, everyone was like, why is the US not getting involved? So why is it so different now that there is clearly something happening, but because it's in the Middle East, we shouldn't be involved, or it's bad, or it's only our interest, and things like that?
I guess it's a question for me, right? I can understand you're saying that it's not the same. Of course it's not the same. But I also was trying to make a point that who are we to say that we're sort of a great judge about when chemical weapons can and can't be used when the United States uses chemical weapons, right? Talk about the double standard, right? So, Israel was using white phosphorus in the Palestine. Why did we not do anything at that point and try to stop that? Right? There's many, many instances when the United States could have done something, could have also listened to its own veterans and not used some of these weapons again, but continued to use them. Right? So it's not to say that, yes, this is wonderful and great, and I totally approve of what's happening in Syria, not at all, but to sort of question and say, what can be done, not militarily, but politically? What can be done to do, the first rule should be, do no more harm. Do no more harm. Don't add more harm. You can, right? Don't add more. This adds more, because bombs are a very imprecise instrument. They say there's precision bombing, but there's also this thing we call collateral damage. Who are collateral damage? They're civilians like us. And that's a risk we take. And so we can say, can we live with that risk? Some are saying yes, and some are saying no. And that's based on our differences in what we think is important, I suppose.
Thank you.
I should add that it is morally outrageous that this has been allowed to continue for so long. I just don't think that the call for a strike that will not change the balance of power, as they say it won't, is the answer. I think the absence of an actual plan on how to deal with, for the United States leadership, and pushing whatever, a military or a diplomatic solution, but pushing some sort of a solution which has buy-in from the key players, the fact that this has not happened and is not happening is what should really morally outrage us. I have family in Syria myself, and many of us have strong connections to the country. And it's not something that we are just sitting and not really caring whether it finishes, it stops, or it doesn't stop. It's, I think we have to also, say, honestly, can we honestly believe that the promise of a shot across the bow or just a warning or credibility kind of attack is the answer? And I really don't think it is. And I think this is very distressing.
In other words, it's not effective. Is this going to be effective? Is this the most effective sort of route the United States can take? Is this military action? A bunch of us are saying no. It's not to condone what's happened so far and that we don't care. But it doesn't seem to be the most effective way to get the results that we hope to get.
Let me just end with a 2-second thing. I want to thank you all for coming here, because this is not going to go away anytime soon. The crisis in Syria will continue, unfortunately, for a long time. The more we become informed about it, the better, because there will be a series of decisions to be made in this country over the next 2-3 years regarding Syria. This is not the first one. This is not the end point. And the more that we can do here on campus to initiate an informed conversation, the better, I think, will serve our purpose as educators here. And I really encourage you all very much to come and see us personally, or come to our events, or both, and participate and make your voices heard. Thank you very much.